Hello. We welcome you to the program today. The title of the sermon, Walk Prudently and Fear God. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 1 to 7. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 1 to 7, Solomon looks to the worshiper, exhorting him to walk prudently and fear God. Solomon considers how one behaves himself in the house of God, and he gives advice for making sure that his worship is not in vain. Number one, offering foolishly. Verse 1. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. The house of God could refer to a general place of worship or to the tabernacle. However, here it most likely refers to Solomon's temple, given that Solomon wrote the book. And so the temple in Jerusalem. It says that when you go to the house of God, walk prudently. More literally, watch your feet, or as in some versions, guard your steps. Of course, walk prudently describes the meaning of the words. The idea is to be cautious, thoughtful, and reverent before you seek to enter into the presence of God to worship. To walk prudently is to show good judgment in your conduct and your speech so that you do not do evil or become guilty of wrongdoing. According to Psalm 89 and 7, we are to come to worship with a reverential spirit. And so the psalmist writes to the children of Israel. Of course, the law given to the Jews we see in the Hebrew scriptures and here in the Psalms, how that they were to come with a respectful attitude. Of course, we can learn from that today as Christians. Psalm 89:7, God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints and to be held in reverence by all those around him. Psalm 5:7, we are to worship in the fear of God. He said, but as for me, I will come into your house in the multitude of your mercy. In fear of you, I will worship toward your holy temple. And so the worshiper should draw near to hear. The word translated here may be literally to listen or figuratively to obey. And so draw near to listen for the purpose of obeying. And so you approach with reverence and respect for God. To hear, or in this case, to listen, is fitting given the context, warning against speaking hastily or making rash vows in verses 2 to 5. And so Solomon tells the people that they should approach God with a reverent attentiveness, to listen with the intention to obey. Jesus said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things that I say to do? And so Solomon teaches that they should approach God to hear, and so that you may obey, not to give the sacrifice of fools. To offer such a sacrifice would be an act of evil. What application may we make of this today as Christians? We learn from James 1:19 that the wise will be swift to hear, slow to speak. And so he's telling them when they approach that they should do so to hear or to listen with the intention of obeying. Be swift to hear, slow to speak, and so come to hear God and his word. He talks about the sacrifice of fools. This may refer to sacrifices that did not meet the requirements of God, and so do not give sacrifices like fools, foolish people. In context, these sacrifices involved words that were characterized as being rash or words that were said hastily before God, here in verses 2 and 3. Now, these sacrifices may have also involved making vows to God that were not kept, verses 4 and 6. Solomon said, "For they do not know that they do evil. They may not prepare themselves for worship, or may not consider their behavior before coming to worship." Think about it. As Christians, we come to worship God. We come on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, to observe the Lord's Supper and to worship Him as He has prescribed and in the ways found in the New Testament. But how have we lived the rest of the week? What is our conduct, our behavior like? Are we living godly lives, faithful to Christ? Here, it may be that they think God will accept their worship, whether it is what He required or not. Some people have that attitude today, as though they can worship God however they see fit, according to the dictates of their own hearts. But is that something God will accept? Will worship? No. Consider what Solomon taught concerning behavior. Proverbs 15:8, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is His delight." Chapter 21, verse 3, "To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice." While the Jews were to offer the sacrifices, they were to also do righteousness and justice. And here he said to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than offering these sacrifices while living unrighteous and unjust lives. Proverbs 21:27, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. How much more when he brings it with wicked intent?" So it's pretty clear what Solomon wrote concerning behavior. Also, consider what Samuel told Saul, the king, concerning obedience. 1 Samuel 15:22, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord?" Think about the people who were offering sacrifice after sacrifice, and yet they were living in disobedience and unrighteousness. Here he says, "Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams." What application may we make today? As Christians, we should approach God in worship with reverence and be ready to hear His word and obey. We should come to worship intentionally, having an intentional plan. Worship does not happen by accident. Think about what we are going to do. We should carefully consider what we are doing. God is concerned with our conduct in worship, and so should we be today. However, God is also concerned with our behavior before we ever come to worship. How are we living before Him? Jesus told the scribes and the Pharisees who transgressed the commandment of God because of their tradition the following. He gave Isaiah's prophecy concerning them, saying, "These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." Certainly we do not want to become like the Pharisees. It matters how we worship God. Jesus said in John 4:23-24, "True worshipers," and there is such a thing, "will worship the Father in spirit and truth." God, the Father, is seeking such to worship Him. Verse 24, "Those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth." It is not optional. Number 2, he warns against speaking rashly in verses 2-5. "Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few." So to walk prudently, to watch your feet, guard your steps, a worshiper of God should consider the following. Solomon said, do not be rash with your mouth. So be slow to speak. He's not talking about how quickly the words come from your mouth, but the idea of contemplating what you have to say before you say it. Otherwise, maybe too late. Do not be hasty or quick to speak, but give yourself time to think before speaking, beginning to speak. Whether you're angry, sometimes people say count to 10 or take some deep breaths. The idea of giving yourself time to think before you speak or act. To be rash is to speak without deliberation or caution. Solomon also says, let not your heart utter anything hastily. As words begin in the heart, do not let your heart utter anything hastily or speedily. Do not be impulsive in thought. And so think before you bring any matter before God. He explains, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. It's important to know who we're talking to. God's greatness and glory in heaven is contrasted with man here on earth. He is so far above us. When you go to the house of God, remember that you are speaking before God or in the presence of God. He concludes, therefore, let your words be few. He taught that the wise are those who control their lips. Proverbs 10:19, in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Don't offer the sacrifice of fools. Be wise before God. What application may we make today? Jesus, in teaching his disciples to pray, admonished them not to use vain repetitions. It's okay to pray and to pray the same prayer, given that the prayer is given in earnest sincerity. But here he warns about vain repetition. And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do. Why do they use these, what Jesus calls vain repetitions? For they think they will be heard for their many words. He admonishes them, therefore do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask him. He later says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. James said that we should be swift to hear and slow to speak. And in James 1:26, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless or vain. Certainly, we do not want to be practicing a vain or useless religion. Jesus warned the Pharisees in Matthew 12:36-37. But I say to you, for every idle word that men may speak, they will give an account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. What we say is important. Solomon continues, verse 3, and he gives an illustration. He said, for a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. Note the cause and effect relationship. Much activity in a dream. Many words and a fool's voice. So we have a cause and an effect. The explanatory for links the many words of a fool's voice to the exhortation in verse 2, let your words be few. And so a dream, he illustrates, comes through much activity. And so maybe excessive activity. What kind of activity? Perhaps cares, concerns, labors, whatever they may be, business. The cares of life often produce restless dreams. Things we dream about are often things that we have been thinking about or trying to deal with through the day or through the week. And just as a dream comes through all of this excessive activity, cares and the concerns that we have in life, foolish speech comes through excessive speaking. Jesus cautioned about us worrying about these things. And as I said earlier, seek God and his kingdom. Solomon wrote how a fool's voice is known by his words. In Proverbs 17:27-28, the wise person, he uses words sparingly. And even a fool is counted wise when he closes his mouth. He exercises his right to remain silent. He holds his peace. He's considered perceptive. Proverbs 18:2, Proverbs 29:11, and other passages describe this. Solomon also wrote in Ecclesiastes 10:12-14, the words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell what will be after him? So here he cautions about the lips of the fool and the danger. He continues, verse 4, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. To make a vow, or the verb vow, to vow a vow to God, is to make a solemn promise to God. A vow might involve actions such as a pledge, an offering, or abstinence. If you make a vow to God, Solomon tells the people, do not delay to pay the vow or to fulfill the vow. And while the vow is voluntary, once the vow has been made, it had to be paid. God takes no pleasure or has no delight in fools, and to do so would be foolish. That is, to make a vow and not pay it. He concludes with instruction saying, pay what you have vowed. So fulfill the vow that you have vowed. Here he has a transition. Pay what you have vowed to an explanation. Yes, a worshiper could choose to make vows to God, like promise deeds. Psalm 66:13, I will go into your house with burnt offerings. I will pay you my vows, which my lips have uttered and my mouth has spoken when I was in trouble. Maybe this is one reason why the vow was made. And again, while voluntary, if it was made by law, it had to be paid or fulfilled. And we see that in the law of Moses given to the Jews, Deuteronomy 23:21-23. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. But if you abstain from vowing, it shall not be sin to you. That which has gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. And again, in Numbers 30, the chapter deals with the regulations under the law of Moses given to the Israelites concerning the making of vows. Of course, we're not under the law of Moses today, but certainly we can still learn from these passages as we are today. As a vow had to be paid or fulfilled, Solomon warned against hastily taking a vow. Proverbs 20:25. It is a snare for a man to devote rashly something is holy, and afterward to reconsider his vows. So again, this is reason why caution needs to be exercised. You might come to regret the vow later and try to change. Solomon says, verse 5, better not to vow than to vow and not pay. It would be better not to make a vow to God than to make a vow and not pay what you have vowed. Of course, only those with every intention of keeping their promises should have made promises. And certainly that's true today too. What was the purpose of vows? Well, People might try to use vows as a way to get something from God in times of distress or a moment of desperation. And so perhaps they try to bargain with God. But vows were meant to be an expression of worship, given to express thanksgiving and to show devotion, and were intended to be joyfully fulfilled. And so this was part of their worship to God. Again, voluntary to make the vow, but they needed to keep the vow once made. Number three, excusing sin, and so avoid doing so. Verses 6 to 7. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God, it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? So do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin. And so we have the part put for the whole. That is, your flesh is put for the whole person. And so do not let your mouth cause you to sin. That's what he's meaning here. And so when you make a vow to God, a sacrifice at the temple, do not delay to pay the vow. And then do not later falsely claim that your vow was an error or a mistake. And so to make a vow and then claim it was unintentionally or accidentally made, or that you really didn't mean it. It was a sin. That's what it was. It wasn't just an unintentional error. It was a sin, and not just an innocent matter or an insignificant one. Solomon warns, why should God be angry at your excuse? And so avoid that consequence. The word excuse is literally voice. And so why should God be angry at your voice? That is, the excuse coming from your lips. It was unintentional. It was an error. And so he will be angry at your excuse. He'll be angry at you. Why should God destroy the work of your hands? We know in life, sometimes the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. That's what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 8:11. But Solomon also wrote that ultimately God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. It may be that he who made the vow has received success from the work of his hands. But what happens if he made the vow and he defaults on his promise? What about this messenger of God? Who was the messenger? The words of God in the New King James are in italics, and so these were added for clarity by the translators. Who is the messenger? The messenger, in the context, is probably the priest in the temple who was there when he made the vow to God. And so some versions read the priest or the temple messenger to explain who exactly the messenger was. And it's probably correct. He is probably talking about the priest here who heard the vow made. Consider what the prophet Malachi wrote in chapter 2:7. For the lips of a priest should keep knowledge, and people should seek the law from his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. So the priest at the temple is probably the messenger, but there are some other options. The word for messenger, as you may know, may also be translated as angel. That's what the word angel means, messenger. And so perhaps the angel is a minister of divine justice. It's also possible that the messenger here is the presence of God himself. If you read the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the presence of God. And so the messenger, the angel, may describe how God himself will bring judgment on the one who sins or offers these rash vows. But I think he's talking about the priest, as we see in Malachi. But it could be an angel or God himself, represented by the angel here. God would prefer, Psalm 15:4, he who swears to his own hurt and does not change. This is the one who suffers while trying to keep his vow, than to change his vow later and claim it was an error. Verse 7, for in the multitude of dreams and many words, there is also vanity, but fear God. And so do not let your mouth lead you into sin. The word vanity is a word meaning emptiness or futility. Earlier, Solomon said how a lot of activity produces a lot of dreams. Likewise, a lot of talking often reveals a person who is a fool. We saw in 5, verse 3. One commentator gives the following interpretation here of the passage. It is vain to present many words, vows, promises to God. The worshiper who offers vain words, emptiness, is in danger of incurring God's anger. And that's certainly true. Instead of the vanity of the multitude of dreams and many words, we should fear God, which is not vain. Chapter 8, verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times, and he may not be judged here on earth or be punished, his days are prolonged. He says, yet I surely know that it will not be well, or it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. And so he who fears God will walk prudently when he goes into the house of God. He will not speak rashly or hastily before God, and he will pay his vows to God. What can we conclude from this sermon today? I think the key admonition of the paragraph is, but fear God. So everything I've said, but fear God. So walk prudently and listen, not speaking rashly or hastily before God. And if you make a vow, do not delay to pay the vow, allowing your mouth to cause you to sin. He says that with many dreams and many words, there's vanity. Instead, he admonishes the people to fear God. And Ecclesiastes 12, 13 to 14, he gives this conclusion. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Solomon goes back and forth in the book looking at thing after thing that are vain. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. One thing that is not vain is fearing God and keeping his commandments. As Christians, our service and worship of God ought to be a practice of the highest honor and sincere gratitude. It ought not to be something taken lightly or in an unworthy way, as if it was some casual matter. Sometimes we are too casual, especially in worship. We need to remember who we are coming to worship. Acceptable worship begins with the fear of God, our deep respect for him. We are taught how we ought to conduct ourselves in the house of God, and Paul is not telling Timothy concerning the physical temple. 1 Timothy 3:14, these things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. But if I am delayed, I write to you. I write so you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. God's house is holy, and as God's people, we ought to behave reverently, knowing that our words matter, they do, and that our worship must be thoughtful. The fear of God is the basis of proper conduct, knowing that God holds his people accountable. And so Jesus said that we must worship in spirit and truth. And so not only according to the truth, but in spirit, in the right attitude. Have you become a Christian? Hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. And if you are a Christian, but you have been unfaithful, then we would encourage you to repent and pray that God would forgive you. We hope the lesson today has been beneficial. There's always more to learn, and we hope that you will continue to come back next time as we study God's Word. And in the meantime, we would encourage you to seek the Lord in all that you do. Thank you.